I really liked the younger Dren, where when she's looking at something, she will like turn her entire head.
Oh, right.
You know, because I guess the eye being on the side of the head, and I remember thinking to myself, that seems very, very animalistic. And I was wondering, like, were there any particular animals that you, when you were, you know, coming up with concepts for Dren, were there any particular animals that you thought, let's see if we can capture some of those qualities from that type of animal? I'm just assuming that that was based on an animal behavior.
Absolutely. Well, Dren starts as prey,
Mm-hmm.
and then she becomes predator because her eyes slowly migrate to the front of her head. And I was looking at a lot of birds. I think birds were kind of my sort of primary influence, but it was sort of a mishmash of things. And at the end of the day, I didn't want to be too analytical about it because in my mind, the mathematics of Clive and Elsa's genetic splicing was such that 1 + 1 = 3, that there would be a dialectic between these different genes that would result in something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And so you could never fully trace exactly what was in Dren. She was always going to be kind of an enigma. And so we just kind of, it was always a case of, well, what works, what looks right.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also going back to what you said before about, you said you cut out about 2.5 minutes of film. Since we'll never probably see that Sundance version, what was the 2.5 minutes of film that you had to cut?
It was, the most significant thing I cut was at the end of the film, there was a short scene where Clive finds his dead brother in the woods.
Okay. I remember you talking about
that. And I took that out. It was a good moment, actually, but it just when things should be building in tempo, it kind of slowed everything down. So I removed that, and there was a lot of running in the wood stuff that we just kind of trimmed down, and little tiny things. I think what happens when you make a movie, or George Lucas, I guess, famously said, you never finish a film, it's just taken away from you. So when I finished Splice, we hadn't really screened it for an audience because there wasn't really any point without all the effects work in. So we just finished the movie. That was it. And then in watching the film with several audiences, I started to see things that I didn't like, little things, but they bugged me. So I trimmed individual shots and so on, and then we added one shot and of course, please don't put this in your articles until after the movie comes out, but for Dren's final transformation, shall we say, there's a beat where there was some confusion. There was like too many things were happening off screen, so I shot Dren's gravesite, and we see some movement in the earth to imply, what's happening. But that was it. It was very surgical, subtle kind of work. And then we spent a week in the mix just cleaning up some stuff. Sorry, it's incredibly boring. But yeah, it's amazing how little, I think hopefully like all the little changes kind of add up, to improve the film.
There were two things I noticed last night when people were asking questions in the audience. One was, and by the way, I am a huge fan of Cube. I love that film.
Thank you.
But I love that film for the fact that you don't explain it.
Oh, thank you.
And there was two questions that I noticed that you got a lot last night. One was questions about a potential sequel for Splice, and then there were people asking questions about, how come you didn't work on the Cube sequels and things like that. And then, also kind of questions about explaining Cube and things like that. And I'm just curious because I know in some of the interviews I've done in the past, when people talk about some of the most controversial films, like even going back to 2001, talking to Keir Dullea and Gary Lockwood and asking them what was Stanley Kubrick trying to say with that movie, and they're like, I don't think Stanley even knew what he was trying to say. And so my question is, do you think some of the best movies of this type are the types of movies that don't try to hand it all to you? And is that something that you as a director consciously want the audience to be able to formulate their own opinions and take away from it what they would take away from it as opposed to what you could give to them?
Right. Yeah, I think so. I think that's why I enjoy being an audience. I mean, not with every movie. Like Star Wars, I don't want a lot of ambiguity with Star Wars. And I love Star Wars. Yeah. I want that should be very cut and dry. Whereas with 2001, I absolutely think what makes it great is the enigma of what the monolith is. And that was, when we were doing Cube, my first film, that was always our touchdown.
Yeah, you made the comparison last night. You said you thought of the Cube as like being like the monolith. I
really thought so. I mean, that one's a rectangle, this one's a square.
Right.
It's not that much difference. And again, not to make any comparisons, but like with Stanley Kubrick, I'm sure what he came up against was this idea of, well, how do I depict alien intelligence? And he realized it's impossible. What he realized is there's no way to do it. It's always going to be disappointing. And I think I can, without naming names, or maybe I could name a few names, like when, they've tried to do it, it just doesn't work because you're trying to describe the indescribable. And I'm sure Stanley Kubrick on some level was thinking what he meant by alien consciousness was God.
Right.
So you can only do it in an abstract, enigmatic way. And that was our feeling, Andre, my co-writer, and my feeling on Cube was there's no explanation that is going to satisfy people with this. It will always be a disappointment. So let's leave that part of it ambiguous, but let's not be ambiguous about the puzzle. We'll give people a puzzle that makes absolute sense, and we went to great lengths to make that puzzle work. And to some degree, I think it's the same with Splice, where the film ends on an ambiguous note in terms of what's going to happen next. We don't really know, but hopefully emotionally the film is very conclusive. Like, I think that Elsa goes through a very clear arc as being someone who doesn't want a natural child, doesn't want a child in a natural way, and then by the end she kind of accepts it.
Well, she's still a scientist at heart, so she can't really just get rid of it.
She can't. She cares too much about it. So, but I sort of like, I don't know why, I'm just always drawn to stories that end, where the end of one story is sort of the beginning of another. But the problem is that usually, to me, the next story isn't as interesting. So I don't, I don't, like with Cube, like I felt sorry for the people who had to do the sequels, because I was like, I don't, no idea where you go with this.